All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about fractions, decimals, and percents. This week, we're going to work on building fluency and moving between these three forms of a number. Fractions, decimals, and percents are all just different ways of writing the same thing. Now, this is going to be a review for some of us, but that doesn't mean it's not important to have it on lock. We want to really make sure that we know what we're doing here. So let's go ahead and get started. So when I talk about three forms of the same number, consider this word cat. It looks like it has been typed, but if I write it like I was writing in a notebook, I might write it like that. And if I was writing it maybe an essay or in a letter to my grandmother, I might write it with a different flavor, a little different flair. I might write it something like that, like cursive, boom. And these three things all still say cat, and we'd all recognize them as cat, even though they really look different. So with that in mind, I want you to think about a fraction, right? We know that a fraction can be written like this. Let's say 25 hundredths. You can probably remember that that can also be written as a decimal. 25 hundredths, we pronounce the place value. And you can recognize that this fraction is less than 1. And this decimal here, obviously less than 1. It looks a little bit like money. It's less than $1. And you probably know that if they're called hundredths, we can write them as a percent. We can call this 25%. And that's great. Those are the three forms. That works when the denominator is 100. What happens if the denominator is not 100? Well, sometimes we have what we call decimal-friendly fractions. Like we could say something like 3/5, right? 5 can be changed into 100. We could multiply it by 20, and we would get a denominator of 100. We'd multiply the top number by the same amount, and we would get 60 hundredths. The decimal would look like this, 60 hundredths. And the percent, of course, would be 60%. So what we see here is that even if the denominator is not 100, sometimes it can be easily changed to 100 and make an equivalent fraction with 100 in the denominator. Those are easy peasy. However, sometimes we end up with fractions that are not so friendly. We might call them decimal haters, right? So consider a fraction like this. Say we have 3/7. There is no factor that I can multiply 7 by that will get me to 100 or even to 10. That could be useful too. So what do I do in that case? Well, I am going to do what we've been doing in the last lesson. I'm going to take the y value and divide it by the x value. Because of the way our number system works, this will give us a base 10 number, or a decimal. Deci, D-E-C, the word decimal, means 10, right? So we'll have this base 10 number. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the top number, 3, and we're going to divide it by 7. 7, of course, doesn't go into 3, so I'm going to get a number that's less than 1, something below the hundredths, or the ones place. And you can see 3/7, that's a fraction that's less than 1. So, of course, the decimal should be less than 1. So 0 in the ones place. I'll show another place value. 7 goes into 34 times. Gives me a remainder of 2. I'm going to keep going here. So 7 goes into 20 2 times. That gives me a 14 with a remainder of 6. There's no end to this decimal yet, which is why maybe it was hard to change into a 10 or a 100, because it doesn't stop at the 10th place or the 100th place, right? So 7 goes into 60. We'll call it 8 times. That's 56. And at this point, I'm going to stop, right? And I'm going to round to the hundredths place. I'm going to say that's 0 and 43 hundredths, because 42 with a 42 hundredths with an 8 after it means that it's closer to 43 hundredths, which of course makes 43%. Okay? So that is the last strategy for changing fractions into decimals and then changing the decimal into a percent. Okay? So just let's back up and review those. There are situations where you have a fraction that's already a tenth or a hundredth. Basically, it's already a decimal. You can just write it as a decimal. Then there are situations where you have fractions that are easily changed to a hundredth or a tenth. when we can write it as a decimal or a percent. And then finally, these last ones that are a pain that cannot be changed easily into a hundredth or tenth. And in that case, we resort to division, right? We call them decimal haters. They make it kind of a pain, but it gives us a decimal number that we can turn into a percent. All right, cool. I hope that's been helpful.